I do like quite looking at a lot of the low carb, high fat / ketogenic diet use in sports, because we've seen lots of research try and evaluate this. Yeah. And one of the interesting things is that you do see certain papers that people point to where, well, look, this group that became keto adapted actually performed better in this sport. But it's interesting that you have to look at, well, what was the performance that they were actually measuring? So for example, there's a couple of really good papers, but the problem with them is that they looked at the performance that they measured was time to exhaustion. So it was a cycling trial. They measured time to exhaustion and see real benefits for a low carb, high fat diet. Now the problem with that is if you're an actual competitive cyclist, your event doesn't require you to say who can cycle for the longest until they get exhausted. It's who can complete this set distance in as short a time as possible. Yeah. So when you're trying to do that and working at those intensities, it doesn't seem to pan out. And we've seen this really across the board, nearly in all sports. Professor Louise Burke from Australia has published some really great papers over the last year or two looking at the kind of body of evidence that we're looking at between low carbohydrate diets versus non-low carb diets for athletes. And it really does seem that virtually across the board, at least if performance is your number one goal, that you do require carbohydrate to drive that performance. And so, like I said, bar something that's Ironman and ultramarathon. And the reason for that is because when you think about, yeah, it's a really, really tough event, but if something lasts you 30 hours, like to stay moving throughout that, you're actually moving at quite a low pace. Whereas it doesn't really pan out in anything else. And people say, well, what about a marathon? Well, think about elite level marathoners. They can hit really high intensities, even to like the last mile. They kick into sprints every now and again. They can clock up quite a fast pace, and it's too fast to solely rely on fatty acids, at least to go and win a competitive event.
Hello friends, it's Mike Mutzel with High Intensity Health. Thanks for showing up and tuning back in. I'm very excited today to be with Danny Lennon. He has a master's degree in nutrition, a very popular podcast called Sigma Nutrition in the sports and nutrition space. I know a lot of you guys probably listen to that as well. And you're competing in powerlifting, I just discovered, which is really cool. But you have a mass program going on right now. So I think, Danny, let's kind of pick your brain on maybe the macros, and kind of talk about protein. A lot of people now a lot of our listeners are interested in keto and all that. And we're talking about how some athletes that their sport really demands a lot of glycolytic metabolism are kind of under eating and under fueling. So maybe let's just start off with fuel in general, for selectively utilizing different macros for sport. And dietary quality. I think that's a key point that a lot of people we kind of gloss over sometimes.
Sure, and I think it brings up that larger point of people making this like false dichotomy of looking at food quality or macronutrients, which is more important, right? Yeah. This whole field of, as long as you hit these certain macros, that's all that matters. Or on the other end, just focus on eating good food and that's all that matters. And really when we look at high levels of sport, we know that there's probably certain rules that will apply to fuel that sport best. And so I think, like what you described, there's plenty of sports where there's a high demand for glucose or glycogen to be able to fuel that to, at least for optimal performance. And so, I mean, outside of really long duration sports like an Ironman or an ultra marathon, you're probably looking at having a high amount of glucose available for at least the time you're emphasizing high performance is going to be important. Now, I think a cool distinguishing factor is that doesn't mean that every athlete that competes in a sport that wants to do well has to eat a really high carbohydrate intake every single day. There's certainly an element of carbohydrate periodization, which we can probably get into, but at least for the times where you want to perform at your best, so most notably in that event itself, you probably want to have the best fuel available to drive that. And for the vast majority of sports, it's going to be having glucose available there, mainly through glycogen storage. So, for example, I do a lot of work with MMA fighters, boxers, even people in a lot of field sports. And as you know, it's critical to make sure we have plenty of glycogen available. And one of those key mistakes is, I need to make weight for this event, or I need to lean out a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out these certain foods, or I'm going to eat just some meat and some vegetables for my main meals. And that ends up causing them to undereat both on carbohydrate and calories, which is quite a common concern we see. But in general, that's what I think you're correct in, that we do see under fueling, whether that's from a macronutrient or a total energy point of view, from a lot of athletes that are doing high amounts of volume of work, but maybe don't understand the importance of those different macronutrients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So what would some symptoms be for people that are kind of under fueling and maybe trying to lean down and eating, like, you know, we're talking online with Sam, like one of his MMA friends, you know, was eating like 2 eggs a day. So you go from high junk food, high calorie diet to, okay, we got 2 weeks to cut some weight.
Right.
So let's just like go hypocaloric for a while. So symptom wise, we're going to see hair falling out, loss of energy, loss of muscle mass. Like, what are some of those?
Yeah, so we try and get to athletes before they get to some really serious symptoms, which you just touched on. And even when we're looking at, say, overtraining syndrome, which is really far down the spectrum, we can probably get there sooner if we look at for some science. So typically what we see is, if it's a glycolytically demanding sport, so let's take either MMA or CrossFit, something like that, and we have an athlete on a chronically low carbohydrate diet, typically one of the things that first gets reported to us from athletes is that they can last the duration of a session no problem, but they can't kick into that higher gear. So just not able to produce ATP quick enough via relying solely on fatty acid metabolism. So by not having that around, they're just having to operate a much lower intensity. And so it's that kind of reporting of, if there's a scramble in a wrestling, or I'm trying to spar, but I just can't kick into that higher gear, that's typically one of the first signs we see. Beyond that, if it's typically just under fueling on calories total, it's probably higher reports of fatigue, and at least higher than what we'd expect this particular athlete to have on a given training program. So when they do report high levels of fatigue, I mean, on any given day, there might be a number of things that affects it. But if it's a run of consecutive days and they have all the other things marked off, like their sleep quality is good, generally their food quality is good, their training volume isn't too high for them as an individual, then probably one of the first places to go is, okay, what's your total energy intake? And is that probably sufficient for what you need? So I think probably athletes need to ask, okay, if you want to perform really well and you still need to, say, decrease body fat levels, or you want to lean out gradually, picking a realistic target for how fast that weight should drop, and then realizing that you probably don't want to massively undereat, or if you're going through that, realizing there's going to be a performance detriment for sure.
Yeah, that's really important. I definitely want to get into specifics on that, but I think you hit on a key point and looking at other things like sleep and stress. So how because you're coaching a lot of high level athletes and so forth, so do you look at nutrition first, or nutrition in the context of all these other lifestyle factors that affect the whole body metabolism?
Oh, 100%. And I mean, you and I think are probably very similar on this, that nutrition is kind of just one piece, and there's a lot of things that are as important, maybe not even more important. That's what I say to a lot of the athletes, particularly when you look at sleep, right? So we can do the perfect nutritional intervention with an athlete, but if they're going to try and perform their best and they're sleeping 4 hours a night, it's just really going to undermine their performance. There's nothing we can kind of counter that with. And so we try and look at weekly averages of a number of different metrics. On the nutritional side, that might be their energy intake, it might be their macronutrient intake. We'll also look at then averages, okay, for sleep time. We may even look at then the specific times that they're waking and going to sleep, trying to get that as a regular pattern. Looking at general activity outside of the gym. Are they going outside and getting enough sunlight for just even like a 10-minute walk throughout the day, rather than so many people now we see that are, sure, you get up and you're giving yourself enough time in bed, but you stay indoors all the time, zero sunlight exposure. All these little things that might not on the surface make a tremendous difference, but when you start stacking on top of each other, they do. So like you say, I think it's important that we can't look at nutrition in a bubble. We have to say, okay, here's just one part of your performance. And so that's what we've talked about with our clients, to see us as more as a performance coach, as a rather just a nutritionist for you, because we want to make sure your sleep is dialed in, your stress levels are okay, that your recovery strategies post-training are at where they should be. And then once they're all in place, then we can really do some stuff with your nutrition. If not, then we're kind of fighting a losing battle from the start.
Yeah, really important point. Has any one of those aspects, you mentioned like stress reduction, nature therapy, sleep, sunlight, which one tends to have the most sweeping effect on the athlete and performance? Is there any one in particular that you're like, once we change sleep from like 6 to 8 hours, like there's a huge shift?
Yeah, sleep 100%. And we know this like across the board virtually with everyone, but particularly with athletes. We've even seen athletes who have inserted like shorter naps throughout the day as well, and just cranking up how much sleep time they're having, tremendous improvements. And then we know that even if it's an athlete that's trying to make weight, for example, we know that sleep is going to have secondary effects on all the other stuff we're trying to mention, right? So not only recovery, or it's going to impact, say, their immune system function. So how likely is it that they're going to get ill from overtraining, or even from a sufficient amount of training 2 weeks before a fight? We don't want to have that. Injury risk goes up. Their food choices change, right? We're going to have these elevations in ghrelin from just sleep restriction for a couple of nights. So I think that's the one that I think has, number one, a direct impact on virtually every system in the body, and then has these secondary impacts on what the athletes are likely to eat, how hungry they're going to be while they're dieting through this phase, and all these other secondary things that are going to, so if they get that in place, it becomes a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, it kind of has a ricochet effect on the whole physiology.
100%.
So there's like the Oura Ring sleep cycle, there's a lot of different, blue light blocking glasses. Any tools or tips that like really facilitate this process?
Yeah, I think having structure to the thing is the biggest thing. So a lot of times an athlete might try and say, okay, I realize I need more sleep, so I'm just going to shoot for 7 hours now because I was doing 5. I'm going to shoot for 8 instead of 6. And if there's no real structure to what they're doing, it's very difficult to going to bed at different times each night, having different wake up times each morning, having no real routine to slowly ramp you down into sleep. And it becomes quite erratic. So you can have the idea that I want to sleep more, and you put yourself in bed for 8 hours, but you might not essentially be falling asleep as soon as you could. You might be waking up throughout the night. You might have circadian rhythm disruption because you have these crazy changes in when you're going to bed and when you're waking up, and all these different factors. So we like to have a structure around it. So is there a way we can have a regular pattern to what time you're going to go to bed, what time you're going to wake up? Can we have a period before that where you're slowly bringing yourself down, that parasympathetic state, trying not only to have, say, limit blue light, so if you need to use a phone or something like that, using like a blue blocking device on that, but ideally staying away from that stuff, staying away from stimulus of watching Netflix right before you go to bed. All the things that are typically talked about for like inducing good sleep quality tie into this broader idea of having structure around it, that I have this routine and this is part of what I do and it's no longer optional. I think once we give that to athletes, that makes a big change of saying, here's some stuff you can try and should do. Some people might do it for a few days, but they might not. It's only when they start prioritizing that this routine is just what I do now. This is part of me being an athlete.
Yeah.
So yeah, routine is probably the biggest thing.
That's so key. And you know what? So athletes are just like I don't want to say microcosm, but it's a really like extreme example of what everyday people should be doing anyway. So the reason why our biology gets so out of whack is because a lot of us don't have routines. And so professional athletes, high-end athletes are just taking their routines and their health to that next level. So anyone listening who's not a professional can still really benefit from exactly what you're saying.
Oh, 100%. And to your point, like athletes are good to look at because like you say, they're essentially a magnifying glass of this stuff. Because if they see a 2% decrease because of something not doing right, it's massively shown up in performance, because 2% difference between two athletes competing against each other is huge. Difference between winning and losing. Whereas someone might take a while to see that 2% from something they're doing, and it's only in the long run this stuff catches up on us. But for sure, I think all those practices are go across the board. And I think one thing that you start to see when you work with elite athletes that from the outside people don't realize is that they think, oh, an elite athlete, it must be so easy, like they have everything done for them, you can just tell them what to do and they're so dedicated and committed. But when you look at it, there's so many athletes that they're just so talented that when you look at what they're actually doing, you wonder, how are they managing to do this, right? Yeah. They're under fueling, their sleep isn't right, they have no real clue about what types of foods they should be consuming, and yet they're still managing to perform well. It's like they've got there purely on like talent and drive and mental toughness. But yeah, they're just the exact same as everyone else, that there's so many things we can improve on.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And the fact that we're all malleable, and even if you don't have that genetic predisposition to be an elite athlete, modifying all these components like we're talking about can help you get to that next level. I did a lot of bike racing and I was so surprised at like the lack of nutrition and just poor nutrition, and yet some people, like you said, really did well. So they had that genetic like slow twitch muscle fiber and recovered really well and all that. So one of the things, going back a little bit, if we want to use your word, the microscope, look at nutrition and macros and things like that, and specifically fueling for sport. One of the things that I kind of have struggled with personally is the idea, because we talk about real food and the microbiome, the gut bacterial diversity, and then we talk about fueling for sport, and we're talking about like maltodextrin and, you know, maybe simplified sugars that, sure, they're not the most unhealthy, but could we pick more natural forms, right? So for people like the holistic athlete, training for glycolytic sports, you know, powerlifting, weightlifting, CrossFit, boxing, whatever, what's the naturalist way to like pair carbohydrates to match that intensity and that type of athleticism?
Sure, and I think this is where having an understanding of what macronutrient requirements they have is important, because then you can just essentially match up what sources you want with that. And I think the amount of work an athlete is doing and the intensities they're working at and the more energy they're expending allows more flexibility for some of those more processed forms you mentioned. So whether that's like pure dextrose or maltodextrin, there's an ability for them to use that with really not too much detriment most of the time, just purely because it's being used and being metabolized for the activity. For people who want to, and again, I think it's generally a good idea, even for high-end athletes, to maximize how much of that is being contributed by actual real food sources that has all these secondary things that go beyond macronutrients. So we talk to them about not only the micronutrients, the phytochemicals, all these things that are going to have long-term implications for their immune system or their recoverability. So I think from our perspective, it's how do we maximize what their main goal is at one time? So we have to realize, for example, that some of our professional athletes, when we're working with them, their goal is to go and be the best they can on a specific date. That might not mean the best for their health in certain things they do, right? So if you take the very extremes, anyone that wins an Olympic gold medal, they're probably going to the extremes, whether that's their training or their travel or whatever it is, that's probably beyond that kind of sweet spot of optimal health. The same, take a bodybuilder, the leanest you can get to, down to 4% body fat. That's probably not good for your physiology, right? You're stepping on stage, but if you were to test them that day, their testosterone is probably through the floor, right? So there's certain trade-offs, and it's just knowing where your trade-off is. So for the recreational athlete that wants to perform pretty well, but wants to look at the food quality side as well, it's like, sure, if you know your carbohydrate requirement, feel free to allocate that towards whether that's sweet potato or oats or whatever that athlete deems is suitable for them. But I do think there is scope for seeing foods that in a black and white view are bad because, okay, dextrose, that's just basically sugar powder, right? So, but in the context of, say, one of our athletes who does multiple sessions per day, has a 5-hour window to fuel between 2 sparring sessions, to try and get their glycogen levels back up by that time, it's probably an ideal scenario to include a rapidly absorbing and digesting carbohydrate as soon after their first session as possible. So something like a dextrose powder. Now, whether a recreational athlete wants to go there or whether they actually are going to need to based on their workload, they're probably not going to be working at the same levels or frequency as a professional, but it's completely up to them. I think there is scope to include more of that stuff. But again, it's not a case where that stuff predominates the diet. I think that's what you talked about before. Like, you can get athletes who, they might think they're really into their nutrition, right? But when you look at it, it's like, oh, you run a few marathons and you know about every single supplement and what gels you should be taking during it. But outside, you don't have a clue about like what normal foods you should be consuming. Your diet isn't that good, but you're living basically on like protein bars and gels.
Cliff bars.
So there's that trade-off for sure.
Brilliant. I think you bring up a really interesting point that a lot of people kind of talk about in that post-workout window of replenishing that glycogen, which is necessary for multiple consecutive like training sessions throughout the day or even consecutive days, right? But is there more to that post-workout use of carbohydrates like insulin signaling, hypertrophy, things like that you want to talk about? Yeah, sure. So there's a number of cool things here, and I think when we talk about like this use of, say, something like dextrose or something post-workout, I think that is really only a concern for an athlete that is performing multiple sessions per day. Or maybe they're doing like a Tuesday evening session followed by a Monday or Wednesday morning session. But for most of us, so say if we're going to the gym 5 times a week or we play a sport 4 or 5 times a week, if you have a window of 24 hours or more between those 2 sessions, there is really no need to prioritize restoring glycogen as quick as possible. If you just consume enough total carbohydrate in that 24, 36 hour window from whatever sources, you're probably going to be perfectly fine. And so I would say to people in that position, don't waste
50 grams of carbohydrate drinking some sugar straight after a workout. You don't need to. You can wait until later in that day and consume your normal meal with maybe some white rice. It might be some from fruits. You have a whole 24-hour window to consume total amount of carbohydrate. So that kind of post-workout carbohydrate intake is probably only required for those who really want to restore glycogen immediately. On the kind of hypertrophy side, again, when you look at the literature on that process of maximizing muscle protein synthesis, you do see that there is a slight elevation in insulin, that's permissive to that to happen. And that elevation in insulin is also slightly anti-catabolic. But what also you see is that we know that not only carbohydrate is insulinogenic, so is protein. And so particularly something that most people take after a workout, say some whey protein or even other animal-based proteins, they're going to create an elevation in insulin, which is going to be helpful to the anti-catabolic process. And once there's a sufficient amount of protein, and mainly leucine, so once we're getting around like close to 3 grams of leucine in that serving, that's going to maximize that muscle protein synthetic response anyway, even if there's 0 carbohydrate available. So purely from the perspective of muscle protein synthesis, you don't actually need any carbohydrate post-workout. So it really comes down to, do you need to restore glycogen? 2, do you need to do it right now, or can you just do it over the next day or so from actual meals? And then 3 is maybe in some cases for someone who's really trying to maximize their muscle mass, then the post-workout window is probably a good time to get in those carbohydrates, because like you say, to that point, it's a good time to be able to get that glucose into the muscle. So not only do we see exercise increases insulin sensitivity, both acutely and chronically, we know that we increase that ability to get glucose into a muscle cell independent of insulin as well. So through that GLUT4 transportation. So I think for people who do want to try and include some more carbohydrates, but find that they would prefer to do it when they're most likely to partition that to muscle cells, then that post-workout window is probably a good idea. But it's certainly not necessary for everyone.
Danny, you said something that's really unique, and I think a lot of people don't understand this insulin-dependent glucose uptake in the post-workout window. Let's kind of define that and talk about maybe the benefits of that.
Yeah, sure. So what we know is that usually to get some glucose into a cell, we know that that's largely dependent on insulin, and then therefore insulin receptors, and allowing that movement of glucose into the cell. What we see, particularly post-resistance training, seems to be most kind of potent in, is that we can get movement of those glucose transporters to the surface of the cell independently of the action of insulin. So in that case, if you do some resistance training, you're in a great position, because these glucose transporters are now on the surface of the cell, to take in a lot of that glucose into the muscle, even in someone who may be insulin resistant or slightly insulin resistant. So this is where a case of someone that's maybe pre-diabetic, insulin resistant, who still wants to include some carbohydrate in their diet because they know it's going to have some benefits for performance, or they just like to have at least some meals that has it in, they don't want to go too low on carbohydrate. If that's their preference, then it makes sense that something like, after doing a weights session in the gym, then taking some carbohydrate there might be a good idea, purely for that partitioning effect that you know it's going to have an increased ability to get into the muscle cell.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, don't want to dive into the minutiae of the biochemistry too much, but it's pretty interesting that, we think about like the glucose transport via insulin, that GLUT4 receptor is not always on the cell. It needs to be mediated via an intracellular signaling pathway induced via insulin. So it's kind of key to talk about. So
yeah, and I mean, it gets into this broader discussion then that I like talking to people about, the importance of physical activity outside of purely a calorie burn. Because people's like, oh yeah, I'm active, I go to the gym every day. But outside of that, like, what are you doing? Yeah. And then it's like just the benefits across the board for your physiology from just generally being active, walking at a slow pace, just moving around. That ties into the same idea that we know that there's changes that go on within the cell purely from movement-based things. So we know like the strenuous part of like lifting weights or even doing other types of activities to a different degree have impacts on things like glucose transporters. And we actually need this movement or this strain and this homeostatic disruption to cause some of these things to happen. And I think it brings up that kind of broader perspective of why physical activity is a key part of all this from a health perspective. And I think it's something that probably doesn't get talked about as much as it needs in the right context, outside of stop just thinking about it as energy expenditure.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So you're talking about kind of the non-exercise activity that people should be doing, because there is some physical adaptations that occur through that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we know like across the board, obviously doing some regular exercise is great, lifting some weights now and again is great, but there's so much that can be, like there's some really cool research showing people that are just more regularly get up out of their chair and sit back down throughout a workday has a completely different impact than someone just staying sitting. And it seems that even the frequency and that how that's distributed has an impact, rather than just doing it all in one burst. So yeah, there's so much that then ties into, okay, from a practical perspective, what do we do with that? Okay, so what habits can we make that we can prevent ourselves from sitting too long? And sure, you might work in an environment where that's called for, but is there any ways you can even just get up from the desk for like a quick walk over for 10 seconds to get some water and back down? Break that up. Maybe you can use standing desk. All these different types of things become important purely for those physiological benefits.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're just in London and decided on most days to, instead of taking an Uber, to take the subway. And so, the tube. And so we're always up and down. And I squat a lot and hike a lot and do all that sort of stuff. And I noticed, I'm like, I'm feeling like different. I wasn't like sore and had DOMS, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness. But I would notice that like, wow, I'm moving my legs, like surprisingly, like all that movement compounds over time.
Right.
So
it's funny. Only me and my girlfriend were in London last week, and she kind of made that same comment. She looked at me, and one day we were coming up from the tube.
Yeah.
We were taking some of the stairs up, so pretty long. And we'd clocked up on one of the days. I think she'd looked like 23,000 steps, and she just looked at me and goes, "If I lived here, I would be so lean all the time." Yeah. And it's just purely from the idea of like, it's just these things outside of formal training that you're just being active. And I think it's a key discussion that for most people is really important. And we really try and hammer that, particularly with fat loss clients, because we know that if you undereat on your calories and you're trying to lose body weight, then you're going to have a suite of adaptations the body makes to try and conserve that homeostasis. So it'll turn down your non-exercise activity of thermogenesis without you even realizing. So how can we put in some like fail safes to help at least keep it up a bit? So maybe we track your step count to see where that's at. Can we put in some like new habits to make sure you're going to be moving, even though your body's subconsciously going to try and turn that down? Yeah. And it becomes a kind of important factor of the whole process.
That's brilliant. Yeah. So the adaptation of reducing calories will generally reduce your resting metabolic rate. So to try and boost that or keep it up, incorporate all this daily activity.
Yeah, sure. And you can see some pretty dramatic differences in NEAT levels. Some of the research on that is really cool, of how even between individuals, the same calorie deficit has a dramatic difference on what that does to someone's non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So, and you really kind of see that from how different people respond to a certain diet. Even if all their stats in terms of their body weight is the same, they're same gender, they're doing the same activity, they both maintain their weight on roughly the same calories, you could drop both of their calorie intakes by 500 calories, but the, I suppose, net deficit could actually be different, because one person could actually end up accounting for that by decreasing their NEAT levels by 300 calories, the other person by only 100. So now you have essentially people on two different calorie deficits, despite thinking, well, I dropped my calories the same amount. And it's really interesting when you see that individual variation in how people change their net energy expenditure through things like changing in NEAT or changing in metabolic rate, for example. And so, yeah, trying to counteract that with some of these strategies is kind of interesting to look at, for sure.
And do you think that the wearables kind of help with that, because it quantifies like the amount of NEAT that people are getting?
Yeah, I think it's just another piece of feedback. So obviously being able to track it and see numbers is useful, but even from a cueing perspective, I think the being in the habit of doing it automatically just increases awareness. So it's, for me, for example, if we give a client a target of 10,000 calorie or 10,000 steps per day, that's what you try and hit, just to make sure you're staying relatively active. Really doesn't matter if the number on their Fitbit is 9,000 or 11,000 on a certain day, right? Probably not too much, but just them being aware to be more active and to try and get to that certain arbitrary number, because it's not a perfect number, but that arbitrary number, just increasing awareness, is making it more likely they're adopting these strategies. And I think that's the same with a lot of these wearable devices. The same with sleep. We know there's a lot of them that maybe don't have perfect sleep tracking on it, at least just yet. But again, it's at least going to get them to the point of being conscious of, oh, I'm going to be tracking this, so I want to make sure that I'm in bed by this certain time, I have to be up then, and then just trying to do the strategies to try and make sure they have a sound night's sleep. So even if you're to think of it from a purely awareness perspective, I think they're really useful for sure.
Yeah, the word cueing is really cool. It makes a lot of sense. And I've been tracking glucose quite a bit. And so that, to me, I realized that stress, it wasn't so much my diet that affected my glucose because I eat pretty clean anyway, but it was more stress or misstress or mismanagement of my stress that had a huge swing in glucose, like 5 millimolar or 100-point swing literally in some events.
Wow.
Yeah, so that to me was like, oh my gosh, I really need to take this seriously. Like those days that I was skipping yoga or meditation, now it's like I don't do that.
Yeah, and that's it. Once you can quantify something, I think it's much more likely that you're going to do something about it, like you said. So it's like we can all know that, sure, like stress is bad and stress management is good, and you know all these strategies already, but once you have this like feedback of this exact number is quantified how much it's affecting me, then it's like it goes from that thing of optional to, okay, this is now just a requirement, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah,
I think
and then over
really
time
cool.
It becomes like a lifestyle.
Yeah, so we love kind of any kind of data driven stuff like that for clients that like to see it, and trying to quantify stuff and look at weekly averages of things, changes over time. I think they all just are able to drive more progress because you can see those changes. You start to be more aware of what affects you. And then just some people like to have stuff quantified by data. Yeah. So it is really interesting to look at for sure.
Totally. That's cool. All right, let's go back to carbohydrates a little bit. In the last 2 years, I've been really exploring with nutritional ketosis and have been just from a philosophical point of view or whatever, experimental, really cutting out the carbohydrates. And then I added them back in intra-workout and post-workout. And notice a huge, talk about like cueing or subjective awareness and tracking things, huge shift in strength and so on. So what would you offer to people, a lot of people that tune into this podcast are keto and all that sort of thing, and kind of carbs are bad, low insulin and all, we forget about the context of these different things. Is there a standard or a ratio, like gram per kilo of exercise or gram per kilo of body weight per hour of exercise, where we can talk about different carbohydrates? Or do you go subjectively based upon the intensity and like body fat and all that? Or?
Yeah, so generally the way we end up a lot of carbohydrate intakes for general people is actually just a function of their calorie intake, which is then obviously because of that, or their energy expenditure, which is going to be determined by their overall general size, the amount of muscle mass they have, and then their activity. So it's taking care of all those things by just scaling it with the calories they're requiring. So we kind of work backwards from a perspective of, let's nail down what we think is a good protein intake for this person. Yeah. Let's then set their dietary fat intake that's at an adequate level, that's not going too low. It's going to give them plenty of room to put in good quality source of fat. And then whatever calories is left over to kind of fill up for their day, let's do that from carbohydrate, with the caveat that we're making sure to get plenty of fiber within there as well. So their net carbohydrate level is going to be good. So we have found a lot of success from using a relatively high protein diet with a lot of people. And again, there's going to be lots of caveats we could say to everything here where we wouldn't do that. But as a general standpoint for people just starting to say, okay, where's a good start point that I can then start making changes from? I think setting a relatively high protein intake is probably a good idea. So we've gone from probably, if you look at somewhere between even 1.7 up to maybe like 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And it's probably a good start point. I think people are fairly familiar within the fitness realm of 1 gram per pound of body weight. Yeah. I think they're relatively decent starting points of what a high protein diet actually is. Once you're from there, we can start looking at fat intakes. We will set fat intakes probably somewhere around the 1 gram per kilo mark, maybe up to 1.5 gram per kilo, depending on what we think that person is going to be suited to best. So that could be, okay, if I have an MMA athlete, I'm going to make sure I'm going to keep them on the lower end of that fat intake so I can allow for more carbohydrate. If I have someone who tells me that they actually have a preference for lower carbohydrate, high fat foods, then we can shift that fat intake up and allow for less carbohydrate. So that is kind of one of our main drivers with a lot of general people in the population of, once your protein intake is nailed down, your fat intake isn't too low, and your calories are on point, really I'm not a believer in you have to hit a specific number of fat and a specific number of carbohydrate. Really they can both vary every day, but in general, where someone goes on the spectrum of lower fat, higher carbohydrate, or lower carb, high fat, really depends a lot on their food preferences. Because we know that if you're your energy balance is in place, your food quality is good, you're staying active, your sleep's in play, your protein intake is dialed in, then there's not going to be a dramatic difference on body composition or health if you have a slight shift up or down from lower carb or slightly higher carb. And then people will kind of make the point, so what if we take someone who then is maybe overweight, they're likely insulin resistant, and you're trying to get their body fat down to get them healthier? What do you think then it's okay for them to go on a high carbohydrate diet? And I was like, well, number one, when you look at a lot of the literature, regardless of the method of weight loss, if someone does lose, say, 10% of their body weight and they're overweight or obese, then you see an improvement in nearly all their blood markers across the board, including insulin sensitivity. Now, that said, I'm not saying that they should be on a high carbohydrate diet. Yeah. And in fact, it goes the opposite way a lot of the time, that they tend to be on a lower to more moderate carbohydrate intake. But like I said, that's not me saying you have to be on this low carbohydrate intake. It's just a function of everything else. That once we set them at a certain calorie intake that's suitable to their goal. So particularly if they're, say, very overweight or obese, they're not going to be capable of doing huge amounts of exercise that say a high-end athlete would do. They might not be moving around as much. They're probably going to want to be dieting down. So their overall calories are going to be a bit lower. We set their protein that we think is sufficient. And then from there, once you set a good fat intake that allows them plenty of good quality fat, the amount left over for carbohydrate isn't going to be super high anyway. So you'll never get to that from a pragmatic perspective. And so kind of to wrap that thing up, because I kind of circled around a bit, I think for me, generally, it's kind of going in a stepwise fashion of, okay, if you've, first of all, starting from a place of where you're looking at your required amount of energy and you have that roughly correct, your food quality is good, you're eating sufficient amount of protein, and then your dietary fat isn't too low, then how high or low the rest of your calories scale with carbohydrate is probably more down to kind of a food preference issue, I think. Because we know for most people who are trying to make dietary change, particularly if they've had poor eating habits in the past or they're trying to lose body weight, the real big issue is adherence. How can we get them onto something that they're not constantly hungry, that they're actually going to stick to for a period of time, that they can actually eat some degree of food that they're actually going to enjoy and maintain adherence for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. So yeah, it gives people a nice kind of framework to work from. You know, if you kind of get the protein locked in place and then work on the fat, and then you're kind of naturally doing lower carb, unless you're a real high glycolytic athlete. And I think it's important for you to kind of qualify, because you said it kind of quick, and I know a lot of our listeners wouldn't understand, but for the non-exercise physiology folks, you said for an MMA athlete, you don't want to go too high in the fats because of their training. Let's talk about what aspect of their training would require a higher carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, so when we look at like classic sports nutrition, we're looking at the ability to derive essentially energy via ATP from different fuel substrates. So we know that the main macronutrients we have, protein, carbohydrate, and fat, have these smaller constituents that can be metabolized for energy. So with protein, we obviously have amino acids. Now they're not really something we need to consider, because a large amount of oxidation of amino acids is only going to take place in some very rare occurrences in general. It's not going to use a large proportion of it. Mainly we're looking at differences in oxidation of the smaller units of carbohydrate, which is glucose, or of dietary fat, which is going to be fatty acids. And we know we can metabolize both of these and generate ATP out the end. And generally for most of the day, when like us sitting here or just walking down the street and doing something at a relatively low intensity, we're probably, or at least if we're healthy, we should be relying on a large amount of fatty acid metabolism and deriving most of our ATP from oxidizing those fatty acids. And so we're mainly reliant on the fat that's there, so that's whether from storage or from food, and metabolizing those fatty acids. However, when we increase and work at a high intensity of exercise, particularly for prolonged periods at high intensities, so something like a boxing sparring session, or a wrestling training session, or a really high intensity CrossFit session, our requirement for ATP goes up, that we have to produce it very, very quickly. And we know that to generate it quickly enough and to oxidize these substrates, we're going to have to do that from glucose. And so that's where the requirement for either consuming some glucose before that session, or just in general having enough glycogen in our muscle and liver to be able to break that down and get some glucose, is going to be required for those high-end sports, because we just need to be able to oxidize glucose for that high intensity. And that comes from the availability of oxygen. So when we talk about that we can both burn or oxidize fatty acids and glucose, we know that we can only oxidize those fatty acids when we have availability of oxygen around. So we're relying on aerobic metabolism, whereas glucose can be used with or without oxygen, it can be aerobic or anaerobic metabolism. And so it's when that availability of oxygen is low at high intensity outputs, we have to switch over to using glucose. And so if we don't have any around, you can only rely then on fatty acids. So what ends up happening is your exercise intensity drops and you can't work at that high, kick at that high gear that we mentioned earlier.
That's brilliant. So when you see things like, there's like t-shirts floating around, don't want to mention the company, but like ketones are better than glucose. What goes through your mind? Because yeah, in one context, like long, slow, intensity where there's oxygen availability and time,
right,
that makes sense. But I mean, if you're a CrossFitter, MMA fighter, or a boxer, glucose is superior to ketones in that context, right? So what goes through your mind, and do you ever have conversations with people about that?
Yeah, and I mean, because it's interesting because I do like quite looking at a lot of the low carb, high fat / ketogenic diet use in sports, because we've seen lots of research try and evaluate this.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is that you do see certain papers that people point to where, well, look, this group that became keto adapted actually performed better in this sport. But it's interesting that you have to look at, well, what was the performance that they were actually measuring? So for example, there's a couple of really good papers, but the problem with them is that they looked at the performance that they measured was time to exhaustion. So it was a cycling trial. They measured time to exhaustion and see real benefits for a low carb, high fat diet. Now the problem with that is if you're an actual competitive cyclist, your event doesn't require you to say who can cycle for the longest until they get exhausted. It's who can complete this set distance in as short a time as possible. Yeah. So when you're trying to do that and working at those intensities, it doesn't seem to pan out. And we've seen this really across the board, nearly in all sports. Professor Louise Burke from Australia has published some really great papers over the last year or two looking at the kind of body of evidence that we're looking at between low carbohydrate diets versus non-low carb diets for athletes. And it really does seem that virtually across the board, at least if performance is your number one goal, that you do require carbohydrate to drive that performance. And so, like I said, bar something that's Ironman and ultramarathon. And the reason for that is because when you think about, yeah, it's a really, really tough event, but if something lasts you 30 hours, like to stay moving throughout that, you're actually moving at quite a low pace. Whereas it doesn't really pan out in anything else. And people say, well, what about a marathon? Well, think about elite level marathoners. They can hit really high intensities, even to like the last mile. They kick into sprints every now and again. They can clock up quite a fast pace. Mm-hmm. And it's too fast to solely rely on fatty acids, at least to go and win a competitive event. And so I think that's the thing I try and get across to people. Look, and again, to your point about context, sure, ketones can be useful. We're seeing cool stuff of how that can be used, even exogenous ketones in sport. And I think there's definitely applications for a lot of that stuff there, but it's not to say it's this or that. It's like understanding what are you trying to fuel and what the athlete needs to do that. And then there's this whole other area that we can get into, but of that we're still not saying that every athlete needs to be consuming like 700 grams of carbohydrate every day, right? Mm. It's for the times that they need to perform at their best, having adequate amount of carbohydrate available.
That's a brilliant last point, and I think that my next question was going to be along those lines of, maybe it doesn't have to be this either or context. Maybe you can mostly low carb and higher fat, high protein most of the time, but around training, should you want to perform at your best, and the training is such that requires it, such as high intensity, short duration, explosive type movements, then you can it doesn't have to be either or, where you can have your carbohydrates during that exercise or post workout window, what have you, and then be the keto person if you like to outside of those windows.
Sure. Yeah. And there's some groups and some really good research within sports nutrition, because we know that, for example, doing training sessions when you have low glycogen available and even having your recovery window without any carbohydrate in it, you actually get some really cool adaptations to the muscle. So there's changes in gene expression, there's changes in mitochondrial biogenesis goes up. So these are all positives for doing certain training sessions and certain recovery windows with a low amount of glycogen available and low amounts of carbohydrate. And like colloquially, this is like train low or recover low strategies. And it's really interesting. And one of the kind of main researchers in this area is Dr. James Morton from Liverpool John Moores University, who is the performance nutritionist at Team Sky at the moment for cycling. And he has a great line around this, that it's not high carb or low carb, it's smart carb, right? Because the way they do it is, okay, we know there's certain benefits to doing some training sessions with low amounts of glycogen. We know for them to perform their best, we want lots of glycogen and lots of carbohydrate. So how do we try and essentially get the best of both worlds? So there's this new kind of, or newer kind of idea that within sports nutrition, it's not necessarily every athlete consume high carbohydrate all the time. It's like, okay, let's look at your training week. Which training sessions are maybe done at a low intensity, or maybe for a cyclist, it's a recovery ride, or something that they're just going through, that the performance in that session isn't the main kind of outcome that they're looking for. So they can do a certain session, and let's say they do it with low glycogen availability. So they've eaten low carb that day, then go and train. They're going to get certain adaptations from that session. So it doesn't even really matter what their performance was like during that ride, because the goal of that training session was to get a certain adaptation to the muscle. Now, if they have a couple of priority rides throughout the week that they really want to push themselves and perform at their best, then sure, the night before, the day before, they're going to make sure they have adequate amount of carbohydrate to fully use for that ride. And it's the same when they have a big event coming up. They're going to make sure they have adequate carbohydrate and high carb days to fuel those really tough training sessions. And speaking of James Morton, he had a great example when the Tour de France was on. So it became like a lot of people started pointing to some of the posts that their cyclists were putting up on Twitter of like, this is what I'm eating this morning. And it was like some avocado and eggs. It's like, oh, look, these guys are doing low carb and winning Tour de France. It was like, they were doing that on certain days for certain stages of the race where they could
flat
get
and they could ride in the group. And
then when they needed to, they can switch it up. So, and it touches exactly on your point. I like his phrase of, it's not high carb or low carb, it's smart carb. And what smart carb is for any individual depends on your goals and your own context.
That is really, really smart. And it's funny. I mean, I think bodybuilders have been doing this a little bit, like training, at least, when they're cutting, like doing like 90-minute like cardio sessions on the empty stomach first thing in the morning. And when I was training competitively in the bike racing, my kind of rest day, recovery day would be like 90 minutes of like 180 watts, and I would just, kind of train fasted and not eat that much during the day. And so it really helped not only keep body weight down, but again, it was more about that adaptation to induce that capillary density, mitochondrial density. Right. And I didn't know back then, 2006 and so on, about the glycogen upregulation and so on.
And that's the cool thing. Like, we're seeing that for so many, like how many years have people been on days I'm training really hard, I'm going to eat more food, I'm going to have some more carbohydrate. Today I'm not doing anything, I'm just kind of sitting around, so I'm not going to eat as much, I'm probably not going to eat those big servings of carbohydrate. And now lo and behold, we're starting to see all this cool emerging stuff of, well, it's carbohydrate periodization and calorie cycling and all these kind of things that really is quite an intuitive thing for a lot of people. But certainly I think, and it kind of goes out to a broader thing of like matching carbohydrates to energy expenditure. I don't think it's like a direct correlation as that, but generally that's the way it pans out, right? If you have a high energy expenditure, you're going to fill more of those calories from carbohydrate sources because you've kind of blocked off your protein and fat.
That's brilliant. But I think it's important what you just said to kind of emphasize, like listening to your body and being intuitive and kind of match the carbohydrates with the intensity and the duration of the activity. But the challenge with that is a lot of people like follow the guru. And like you said, so if the guru wins a Tour de France and he posts a bunch of pictures, or he or she, of eggs and avocado, then they think, okay, I can do that every single day, right? And so if the guru does it, then it must be right. So it's good to again listen to your body, listen to what we're kind of talking about, and match intake with expenditure.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point for people to remember. So if they're coming on to even listen to any of us to try and give them, this is the recommendation you should follow, it's not going to pan out like that. Like, we can't honestly say this is what everyone should be doing. So it's more like, okay, let's look at the scientific literature. What is kind of emerging as these are good ideas based on this is what the body of evidence says. But then to also remember that any of those individual studies, or even a group of studies, is looking at, on average, if you do this, what is the likely result? So that doesn't tell you as an individual what's going to happen for you, given all the context you're doing and how you even genetically respond. So the problem is that for any of this type of discussion, it requires then, for someone to implement it, actually a lot of legwork themselves. So taking these ideas of, okay, this is the kind of what we're seeing as probably a good idea from the perspective of what the evidence base says. But how can I now play with this to kind of tease out for myself what's going to exactly work for me? So to your point, how does someone know, well, do you respond better to a bit higher or a bit lower carbohydrate? Well, there's no way we can tell you. It just takes a bit of work. But what we can do is try and get you to start from the closest point possible. And that's all science is, right? It's like, how do we approximate you closest to the truth? And then everyone else has to do their own kind of legwork to play around with some of this stuff.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, thanks for that kind of. And maybe a transition here. You have a great podcast, Danny, Sigma Nutrition, that I think a lot of folks would be interested in. And right now you have this MASH program that you're kind of running people through and so forth. So any kind of parting words of advice on hypertrophy and mass that we didn't get to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So I've done a few talks recently on this idea of hypertrophy, and from a nutritional standpoint, what are some of the things that are kind of that we know from literature are going to help you emphasize that. The main one I think that most people realize is that overall calories, but there are some misconceptions. So first, I mean, from a starting point, your training program has to provide a sufficient stimulus. So it has to be well designed, has adequate volume for you to grow, and you have to have some sort of progressive overload. So let's say we have those things knocked off. From a nutritional standpoint, what are you looking at? One, you're looking at, okay, how much energy are you going to give available to you? And I think where there's a misconception is people realize, yeah, if I'm trying to build mass, I need to eat more food. But there's a trap to fall into, is that it doesn't mean more calories equals more muscle mass gain, in that there's a kind of a very narrow range of how much muscle we can actually build week on week or even over month on month. And the rate of gain is actually relatively slow, particularly when someone contrasts it with how quickly they can actually lose body fat. I mean, you can do an aggressive diet and drop it quite quickly. Muscle mass gain takes a long period of time, and it doesn't matter if you just overfeed by more and more, that's not going to drive more gain. So you can't force feed muscle mass gain. And Eric Helms has a great quote. He says, calories are not the driver of gaining muscle, they're simply permissive. So you just need a slight enough surplus. So maybe a few hundred calories over your normal maintenance intake. That just means you have that extra few resources to drive towards this process of building muscle, which is quite an energetically expensive process in the body. So once you've that sealed off, I think looking at protein intake is where most people's mind goes. And sure, protein has an important role. And I think if we look at those numbers I gave earlier, something around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is a kind of real good start point, or 1 gram per pound. And that as a start point is probably sufficient for the vast majority of people. But we're starting to see some really cool research of the importance of the distribution and dosing over the course of the day. So it's not just, okay, you want to eat 150 grams of protein today, so you can get that in one meal and it'll have the same effect as if it was distributed differently. Now, from a very practical perspective, for a lot of people that aren't trying to absolutely maximize it, it may not matter, the meal pattern or the distribution of protein as much. But if you're looking to maximize, from a theoretical perspective, that muscle protein synthetic response, then you're trying to look at, okay, to distribute that, we're looking at, it seems to be at least 3 to 4 meals split throughout the day, with a kind of few hours between those as a kind of minimum. Now, if you want to eat 6, great, fine. If you want to only eat 3, probably fine as well, but to have some spacing between those meals. The dosing in each of those meals, again, seems to be somewhere between 20 to 30 grams-ish, depending on how big someone is, how much muscle mass they have, and then age comes in as well. We see the response to protein feedings decreases over time with age. And then there's also some looking at that in that post-workout window, you might need a slightly bit more protein to maximize that MPS response. So maybe up as far as 40 grams for some guys. So it just means that, and they're very achievable targets for people who are emphasizing good quality protein feeds. So if you use a supplement, it's going to be like a scoop and a half whey protein. It could be a chicken breast. It could be a piece of fish. It could be a few eggs. It could be a piece of steak. All these things are going to be really useful sources of high amounts of protein. And most importantly is that it's not just the protein, and I kind of touched on it earlier, it's one of those branched chain amino acids, leucine, that is a real driver of that MPS response. And so we know that the best sources of leucine are going to be animal-derived proteins. So like we say, whey, beef, etc. So if you're getting those like 20 to 30 gram servings of animal-based protein, you're probably getting enough leucine, you're maximizing that response. So at least from a theoretical point of view, you're ticking all the boxes. If you are a vegetarian or a vegan, or you're using those plant-based sources, you may either need a higher dose of protein in total, depending on the source, or you might want to supplement some of those with some added leucine, which is another strategy that vegan athletes in particular can use to try and maximize MPS without using animal-based protein. So I think they're the big ones that we can kind of talk about, but we can go into any direction you want. But I think for a lot of people, once they have a sufficient stimulus, their energy intake is a slight surplus, and they're maximizing their total protein intake and that distribution, that's probably going to be a large way to go from a nutritional standpoint, at least.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective, and I like how you really broke that down and organized it in that way. So it's key, in the bodybuilding community, we have like the bulking phase and the cutting phase, and then you see like these huge swings, like 50-pound swings. Right. And so it seems that, they have the stimulus, but then are overdoing the calories, which, yes. Again, obviously, like you mentioned, building muscle is energy intensive, but you don't need a super surplus. Yeah?
Yes.
So that's key. So you can kind of stay lean while you're bulking up in a sense.
Right. And there's going to be some body fat accrual, but that's going to be, like you say, slight over many months. So it should be a point where someone can like go into a gaining phase, quote unquote, for many months and see this maybe slight uptick in body fat percentage, but certainly not these rapid gains. Because like we said, you can't force feed more muscle mass gain. Mm-hmm. You just need enough for those processes to be permissive to actually grow it. And there's some really cool studies looking at that, where they had two groups who were very similar. They split them into two, and they had them overfeed. One group overfed by, I think it was around 500 calories-ish above their maintenance, the other group by 1,000. And when you look at the end of the program, they did a 12-week training program. And at the end, there was pretty much the exact same amount of muscle mass gain between the groups, but there was a 5-fold increase in the amount of fat mass gained by the group that overfed by 1,000 rather than 500. So all these extra calories they were consuming was for just more fat mass, which means when they go into their this cutting phase, they kind of spend longer there. So if you think on average, if we take a 12-month period, and you're going to have some phases of gaining, some phases of leaning out a bit, if you have to, if you bulk so much that you put on loads of body fat, it just means you're going to have to spend more months of the year dieting down, rather than very gradually coming up. So I think that's important for people to keep in mind, and be a bit more realistic, and go on the lower end of how much body weight they should be gaining over time.
Yeah, really good tip. So that program is going on right now, right? Your MASS program, or no?
So the just to kind of confirm, the program that you're talking about, MASS is a new research review done by 3 friends of mine. So it's not in any way me.
Oh, okay.
It's something that I definitely
emails
think, yeah. So I definitely recommend people check that out. But really, 3 smart guys. So one I mentioned earlier, Eric Helms, who is a researcher in New Zealand at the moment, part of 3DMJ. He's doing some really cool research on autoregulation. So really one of the smart guys that's involved in kind of strength training research. Dr. Mike Zordos from the University there in Florida, again, great researcher based on a lot of strength training stuff. And Greg Knuckles from Stronger by Science. So another remarkably smart guy. I think they're really ethical in the information they put out as well. Don't oversell stuff, don't overhype stuff. Base everything on clear evidence, and give some really good practical takeaways. So they have a new research review out, which is really useful for either us as practitioners or for people interested in strength training, that number one, don't have the time to go through all that kind of different research studies and the amount that they get through. But number two, I think for people who maybe struggle to read a research paper and be able to make accurate interpretations of what it's actually saying. Because it can be quite difficult, and even for me, there are certain research papers, if the statistical analysis, for example, is very advanced, I'll have to check with someone who is really big in statistics to see that my interpretations are correct, or if they're valid to say that. So I think it saves a lot of the legwork for people, but it's a service that I recommend people check out for sure.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. I mean, if you look at materials and methods, and then how the stats are analyzed, root mean square of something or other, and you're like, well, or inverse log, there's all these different things. You're like, what are we, how are we manipulating the data and such? So is it biased, or are you intentionally trying to take some figures to make it look like the way that you want it to look? Or yeah, that can be challenging.
Yeah, for sure. And I think even the idea of looking at 1 or 2 studies is almost meaningless unless you look at the totality of the evidence, right? So science becomes useful when we take a broad view of a lot of studies in a certain area and see which way it's leaning, because I mean, how many areas do we look at there where there's no 100% consensus in nearly anything, right? Yeah. We can find one research paper to point to pretty much any argument we want to make. So understanding that and not getting oversold on certain papers, and then also realizing that there is a difference between 2 different papers, depending that some are done extremely well, some are pretty good but have some limitations that the authors are aware of and they outline. And then some papers are just like, to be honest, it's crazy to imagine how some of them got through peer review. But being able to realize that is a skill that takes a lot of time. And so it definitely is worth checking what other people that are experts in that field think.
Yeah, really good idea. Absolutely. Love it, Danny. So we have a few personal questions we'd like to ask every guest on the show, you know, and one of them is like about exercise, like your favorite exercise. This can be a squat or just weightlifting in general, just something that you feel has a high hit rate for yourself and maybe other people. If there's only one exercise or one movement that you could do for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm biased seeing as I'm into powerlifting at the moment. I think I love squatting. Again, it's just, I think, a movement where it's challenging not only just physically but mentally, very different even to the other classic power lifts, that getting under a bar with that certain amount of weight, and I've posted something before about how powerlifting in general and even like just heavy squatting for people who don't compete can almost teach you stuff about life, in that you're constantly, if you're progressing over time, if I get under a bar now and I have a new weight that I've never squatted before and I sit down and stand up, I've literally done something that I've never done before, that 2 weeks ago I physically wasn't able to do. That if I'd sat down under that bar 2 weeks ago, it literally would have crushed me to death. And now I've done something, I've followed a process, I've been patient, I've built up over time, and then now I've been able to do something new, and I'm better at that. And I think that parallels with a lot of things in life, right? No matter what it is, that if you want to get better at something, put a process in place, be patient, pay your dues, keep tipping away at it, and then eventually you break through something. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's beautiful. I mean, a lot of things come to mind, like the foundation, the core, the foot placement, you know what I mean? So there's a lot, you can't really circumvent or hack an increased squat, which is really cool. You have to actually do the work, and that's really in the real world how you progress.
Right, and that's why I like it. It's much more technique oriented, or at least to have a good quality squat, you almost can't get away with really poor technique. Whereas we know, like, a deadlift, sure, there's a lot of technical cues for it, but you can have someone that's just brutally strong and can just rip something off the ground. Or you can have a guy that's just like this crazy bench press, he's got this massive upper arm strength, but squat has these nuances where you do need to pay that time for skill acquisition to get good at it.
Yeah. I love squatting, but when I go too heavy, I always hurt my back. So now I'm kind of doing front squats and goblet, kettlebell squats and things like that, or like different progressions, if you will, to try and maintain that intensity and still progress. But yeah, I don't know, unless I do really low bar back squats, I do a lot of gardening and other things too. So it's like, it's context dependent.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's one thing people don't realize, that it's not this like golden thing. And if someone's not competing in powerlifting, for example, yeah, you can do anything. You can just only ever use a leg press machine and be perfectly strong and functional and doing everything you want, for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. So let's take kind of the same thing like we talked about exercise. If there was one herb, nutrient, or botanical, you're stranded on a desert island, vitamin D, omega-3s are covered, what are you bringing with you? Man,
that's a really good question. I would have jumped to vitamin D, only you mentioned it there. I think for me, I think a lot of the stuff of getting something that's going to give the biggest bang for its buck. And so I know I'm kind of getting away from like one specific nutrient, but I would try and find, like, I think something like big bang for its buck to me hits me as something like either like a greens powder, where it's going to have like just perfect for like as many, like blend up kale or broccoli, something like that, so much goodness in there, or something like maybe some lamb's liver. If I could do that, then just packed full enough stuff. So I don't know if I got away from your question.
No one said those two before, which is awesome. Everyone talks about curcumin and magnesium, and things like that, so it's always good to get a different perspective. Yeah,
because I mean, for me, it's one of those questions of if we isolate anything like that, then what does its worth become as well? In that we just know nutrient wise that it's a synergy of so many things, and that's why we try and have this variation and nutrient density. So that's why I think something like lamb's liver comes to mind, or whether that's a greens powder or some like green vegetables, because you're getting a real bang for your buck. Whereas anything isolated on its own it's gonna be tough.
Brilliant. Yeah. Awesome. So next question, your morning routine. We know successful people kind of have, we talked about routines earlier, like bedtime routines. And I think a good bedtime routine is starting out with your morning routine at some level, right? You've interviewed a lot of people, asked a lot of questions. What does the first couple hours of your day look like?
Yeah, so typically, I don't have a normal, like typical day, because things are different, but generally it would be get up, I'll have hopefully a list made from the night before. If not, I'll make it that morning of what really needs to get done that day. I'll go down, make myself some coffee, and then I will, if possible, try and tackle a big task that if I know I get this done, it's almost like a weight lifted off my shoulders. Because if I try and do it the other way around, I mean, I could spend a couple hours like flicking through some emails, doing bits and pieces, like, and running through like a list of things, but I still feel uneasy because like, oh, there's something I should be doing.
Yeah.
So it's that thing of, okay, if I got this done now in this block of time, what would make the rest of the day just feel like, okay, I've a bit less done, I've almost been productive already because I've got this thing done. I think that's a really useful strategy for most people, because they're the hardest things to get done, for sure.
And we tend to procrastinate and do that thing like right before bed or whatever.
Right.
Brian Tracy's book, is it Swallow the Frog? Something along those lines?
Eat That Frog, isn't it?
Eat That Frog, yeah. So like you just get it out of the way, get it done, do it early. Well, you have that willpower in the morning.
Right, yeah. So I think that's important. I think it just allows to build momentum over the day as well. If you've got off to a real solid start, whatever that is, then it builds momentum. And different people find different things. They might not tackle a task at all until that evening, but their momentum is built through a walk or some meditation or whatever it is. It's finding that thing that once you do it, you feel set up to tackle everything else.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. Along those lines, if a politician turned to you, Danny, maybe in a lift or an elevator, a parliament member, maybe someone from the WHO, and said, Danny, you've interviewed a lot of really influential people in the health and wellness space. What's the high hit rate thing where I can make a big impact on the world and the community at large? What comes to mind as something maybe when it comes to like the population at large that could be malleable?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the big thing when you think of like general population is the pure confusion that's around health and nutrition, in that like so many people, how many messages that they got of like 1 week something is good for them, the following week it's bad, or there's this group that sound really smart that's saying one thing, this group that is also sounding really smart that's saying completely different. So how can we get some messages delivered in a way that are actually going to make them spread, right? Because at the moment, like, people have enough information, or at least access to information. Every government has these like nutritional guidelines, but yet we see that there's still not this kind of uptake or almost belief in a lot of these. And it's getting back to this idea of, okay, what does it really take to get a good idea to spread? Like, how do we get beyond saying, okay, I'm doing my bit by putting out good information into the world? How do we make it in a way that's actually going to be tangible to people, that they're actually going to take it on board and going to use that? How do we, and I think from a public health point of view, that becomes difficult because we know some people just don't want to change certain things or want to live the way they are, so that's fine. So maybe it's a way that we say, okay, we can't force people to do these certain things that are going to be good for them. So what things can we influence? What things that if people are kind of like indifferent to two different choices, can we take away the kind of worst choice from that scenario, so that people by default are doing things that are healthier? And so there's like loads of different interventions around the world that people are trying to get people more active or to be more aware of things. It's a really tough question, and I just don't know if I have a good answer to it, because it's something I've thought about a lot. It's like we can learn as much as we want, and like we can reach people, and so often we see that the people that are most heavily impacted are the ones that really bought into that process, that took responsibility for the information they're hearing, and like I said earlier, did the legwork to actually make it part of their life. So how do we do that with people that don't want to is a real challenge, and I'm not too sure that I've got a solution to it yet, but I think the first thing is like, how do we get people to kind of agree on some core things that everyone should be doing?
Yeah. So if I heard you correctly, it's more like, how do we make it stick for that individual? And then so it causes or induces that lifestyle change. So how can we make it kind of sticky? And one thing that I've kind of been grappling with this idea as well is this idea of flow. And so different people get into a flow state and that calm, kind of that real, kind of not out of body, but real focused type state with different types of exercises, right? And so if we know that there's a lot of benefits from weightlifting or weight training, from blood glucose responses, hormonal responses, etc., but you don't get into a flow state with weight training, then stick to yoga or stick to Pilates. Right. So maybe the same thing with different diets as well. Some people feel really well on keto, other people like carbs, some people like fasting. So it's really finding what really works for you and trying different things. And if it really drives with you, then stick with it. And if a guru says something, then just like let it bounce off your shoulder and don't get too persuaded.
Yeah. And it's a kind of mantra almost at this point for people who listen to the podcast that I've said over and over, is that we have to get to the point of understanding principles versus methods. Because when it comes to nutrition, for example, there's a whole host of methods you can use to be successful, right? Name any type of diet and you'll find people who have been successful on it and people who have failed with it. You find people who have a preference for one thing versus another. You find people who are vegans who are super healthy, some who have had worse health because of it. You go people who have done really well on a ketogenic diet, people that don't, and vice versa. So there's so many methods out there. And I think the problem and where the confusion lies is that people are thinking about the method or hearing these arguments of my method is better than your method, instead of saying, okay, what are the core principles of nutrition that we need to tick off? Because if we understand those few principles, and there's not too many that make a difference for health and body composition, then what way you arrange that can be completely up to the person. And there's so much more flexibility then. So if we understand that to be healthy, you probably don't want to have a massive surplus of calories all the time. You want to make sure you're not going super low in dietary fat. You want to make sure your food quality overall is pretty good and not predominantly processed foods. You want to make sure you've got enough micronutrients to not be deficient. You want to make sure your fiber intake is good. And then when we know that like you don't need to be worrying whether you have 5 meals a day or 4, then we can get away from those like minutiae and say, okay, how I'm going to organize my day is going to be completely dependent on that person. Some people like to start with a large breakfast. Some people despise that idea, so maybe they want to do an intermittent fasting thing. There's so many methods, and it's like, instead of worrying about which is best, let's look at the principles and then you design it around that.
That's beautiful. Wonderful. Love it, Danny. So let's talk about the podcast. Sigma Nutrition. What's your website? Where can people find you online?
Yeah, cool. So the best place to find me is sigmanutrition.com. Pretty much everything is there. Podcast, articles, stuff that we've got going on. The podcast itself is available on any podcasting app, iTunes, Stitcher, etc. Just to search for Sigma Nutrition Radio. And social media, it's easy enough to find me. Just type my name in. Instagram, DannyLennon_Sigma Nutrition. Facebook, we have a Sigma Nutrition page. You can find me personally, all that type of thing. But yeah, sigmanutrition.com will bring people to everything, and all the details are up there.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's a wonderful podcast, Danny. I just want to have a moment of gratitude. I don't listen to many health podcasts because I get bored of all the health stuff and like business and mindset and different things. But if I do listen to a podcast, literally, I listen to your podcast. I really do.
That
like
means a lot coming from you, Mike. So thank you so much.
And you had me on, it was about 2 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, I think it was like episode 40 something, if it reminds me correctly. We're at 177 right now. So
brilliant.
It's been a while, so we must do a part 2 sometime.
Sure, down the road. Danny, appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure,
my
friend.
Yep. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll put all the links to the show notes and Danny's podcast on the description below. Have a good day.